It's been a wild 24 hours with Inside Star Citizen and now Star Citizen Live. I was very impressed by the EVA and interface updates yesterday, but I have to admit I was totally shocked with what they shared in Star Citizen Live today. If you haven't seen that yet, you should go watch it. The whole thing, even the last section. It's worth it. I hope you'll come back here, but that hour of content is the most important in years, so I'll understand if you're busy running into the walls after watching it. I know I was. As you all know, I'm not a reactor. I prefer to take a beat and think things through, find a more, nerdy take on the topic. In this case, there are so many topics, I found myself with my trusty notebook sketching things out and trying to figure out the most fundamental question. How the heck are they going to get all this done? Well, I have an idea. I want to be clear. I believe what I'm going to talk about is accurate, but it clearly isn't the full story. And I'm going off information gleaned over years of little tidbits, so please understand that as we move forward. A quick note here to those reactors who rightly are skeptical. I am as well. Please watch to the end of my conclusion before labeling this as a puff video. This is a story that goes back, the full history of Star Citizen. However, let's start 6 years ago. This is the serialized variables video. I was pointed to that in prior comments. Thanks for that, guys. I'll put the link in the description below. While I was very confused as to why it mattered from a networking perspective, it wasn't until today that I finally put the last little bits in place. So let's start with the basics. Modern networking hardware can serialize data at line rate. So when I watched the video from a networking perspective, I wasn't that impressed. We will be getting into that in the Network Sagas podcast shortly, if you don't know what the term means. So keep an eye out for that. When I rewatched it today, a huge light bulb went off, and I understood what some of the more techie members of the community likely have for a long time. Honestly, the content in that video is also not breaking new ground. As I said on the podcast with Tomato and Kevin, it's evolutionary at best. What I don't think I said well enough was how taking a bunch of evolutionary technical steps and combining them with a truly innovative architecture results in a revolutionary output. It's amazingly rare that anyone comes out and changes the world overnight in the tech world. Every revolution had its foundations laid over decades. The part that most piqued my interest in that video wasn't the serialized variable section, though that was interesting. It was the fact that 6 years ago they were segmenting the game code from the infrastructure code. I refuse to use the term netcode, as it is, it's just the wrong term. Netcode is what happens at the OS adapter layer and also runs on routers and switches. I get that it's a term used to generalize a huge lump of magic, but I think it's overdone in this case. Saying infrastructure and separating network is much more accurate to me and doesn't lead to confusion. So let's take a look at this in the context of the crazy set of deliverables they have for 3.23 and understand how they believe they can build the largest update to Star Citizen since the PU came out in 4 months or less. I'm going to split this conversation into 3 sections. I don't believe this is the full stack, but it will help to narrow things down for this conversation. The first is the game code. This is the code that will run Squadron 42 or the PU client on our systems. Next, we have the infrastructure. This is the code that will run on our systems or in the server of the MMO. This would be things like mining or combat. The client infrastructure would do what it can locally and process the information what it can't do through the server. And finally, we have the network. Obviously, this lets the MMO side talk. Using this, we can now start to talk about the decision to move most development into Squadron 42, a decision at the time I was angry about. However, what that gave them was a chance to work in the background on all the core requirements, because you need to build the infrastructure to support a player accomplishing tasks before you can build that into an MMO, which is exactly what they did. For years, they've been hammering features into the Squadron 42 game code, and I think we can all agree that it looks very, very good. They did this using the exact same structure that the online game will use, but without having the bottom layer. So in the single player mode, the infrastructure is the bottom layer. Obviously, with a little network code in there to link it to the servers, and one would assume for some online features like news, patches, perhaps friends lists and chat, but who knows? So, much like a developer can create a game for Xbox and then port it to the PS5 in a reasonable amount of time, because they use the same code to create the game, but attach it to different infrastructure when it's going to be compiled. Features can now be checked into the PU branch with relative ease, and they already know that the in-game side of it works because it's been tested. So the next step is to ensure that the infrastructure supports the needs of the features. I'd guess that the network team has been working in the background this whole time, watching the various feature teams work, getting a list of capabilities they'll need to deliver to connect the network on the bottom. Now, obviously, this isn't going to be plug and play, but the level of work and debugging as these features are ported in is going to be a tiny fraction of the work to create them in the first place. We actually use a system like this where I work, though we don't need anything as complex as this. But once the infrastructure supports a function, the devs can use that function in all of the applications above. And that's the main point of the serialization video to me. The efficiency of serialized variables is critical for optimization, don't get me wrong. However, the key item making all of this work is using that abstracted code base that can then be connected to a local infrastructure for Squadron 42 or the local infrastructure and the network for the persistent universe. Let me put up a simple flowchart I hope will help those who aren't following me. In Squadron 42, we have a bunch of capabilities. I've included a few here just to help scope it. Obviously, there are thousands more. Those capabilities must be fully supported by the infrastructure to run locally. So the infrastructure must be able to do all the compute work for everything that happens in the game. On the PU, we have game code that hasn't changed much other than PES in a long time. Just being honest here. That connects to an infrastructure right now and creates the server we all love to hate. Then that server connects to a network and we all wait for the 30K. In the new version of the persistent universe, the feature code from the Squadron 42 branch can be checked into the persistent universe client. Now, obviously, they don't need every little bit of a fully MMO-enabled feature for single-player games. So it's likely that the network team has been adding those features I spoke about in the background. And now they just have to connect the Squadron 42 branch to the new capabilities in the infrastructure and test them. But they don't have to rewrite anything. And if all goes well, this should be a fairly painless process. Now, we all know it isn't ever going to all go well. And I believe that we need to respect the complexity of this effort. I expect there to be some level of failure rate in this process, whether it's feature slipping or not being as fully implemented as we might like. So I hope I've given enough description of why I think it's possible for 3.23 to meet their goals, even with a decade of work that has never resulted in a change this big. That doesn't mean it will happen. And it doesn't mean I expect everything to be flawless. It means that I don't think they're going too far out on a limb if the work they've been doing since 2016 is actually in place and has been refined in that time to enable this very task. 3.23 is the most important step since the persistent universe was released. If they get close to what they're hoping to do, then I think the future looks bright. If it looks more like 3.18, then I'll have very real fears for the future. So, to any CIG people watching this, I'm pulling for you. I know you know the stakes with this release. I'll do my part to continue trying to help people understand. But I spend enough time putting lipstick on a pig in my day job, so I'll call it out if I believe things are falling apart. One last request. If you would consider liking or subscribing, maybe even sharing this video out to your friends, I would really appreciate it. And if you want to go over the top, and I don't expect anyone to do this, but if you hit that thanks button below, you can toss a donation in to help with some of the expenses. Again, thank you all very much. I hope you found value in this. Have a great rest of your day.